Hi everyone. I just wanted to check in and give you guys a little refresher on the whip stitch and the buttonhole stitch. Those are the two stitches that we're using on our lemon ornament. So let's just take a look. I've got the base piece for the skin of the lemon, and the first thing we would do is stitch our darts. So let's just do a little refresher of all of it here. So at the bottom of my dart, you can see where the dart ends. I want to first put a starting knot in my thread. So I'm going to lay the end of my thread under the needle and on my finger here. Then I'm going to wrap around 3 times to get a nice knot with a single thread. If I have a double thread, I can do less wraps. And then I'm going to push the needle through those wraps and pull it down. And then I have a nice organized knot that's not messy at the end of my thread. All right, so back to the dart. So here's the base of the dart. You can see right there. I'm going to fold those together, and I want to start stitching just through the surface of the fabric, just beyond the end of the cut. And that will get me lodged in the fabric before I start actually stitching the dart. So the way I'm holding this here, I like to use my fingers as sort of a launching pad for my stitches. And as you do this more, you'll get used to where you need to hold your hands and your fingers in relationship to this edge to get a nice 1/16 of an inch seam allowance. So let me get the first couple of stitches in here, and as I do that, I'm going to explain what I'm doing in each motion. So the first thing is to use my finger as the launching pad and go through these 2 layers. So what I want to make sure that I'm doing is entering the fabric and exiting the fabric at the same depth. If I go in at an angle and grab more of this side than this side, then I won't have a strong seam. So that's why you want to spend some time getting used to where your fingers are and checking both sides of your stitch. You can kind of rotate it and make sure that you're at the same level on either side. Now, the next thing that you'll run into is that your stitches might look floppy, like they're kind of leaning back this way or leaning forward this way, and so they don't line up nice and neat. To get your stitches to line up neatly, same thing, obviously, you're gonna go in, use your fingers as a launching pad, and then as your thread comes down like this and you've got this little loop, you just slow down a little bit, and these 2 fingers have a lot of control of where that loop goes. So what I like to do is kind of make a fine adjustment, make sure that it's going straight up, and pinch a little bit. So if I pinch the felt with my fingers, it holds that loop so it's going down vertical. And then at the end of each stitch, I make a little tug. I do that all with this hand, but I can manually show you a little bit easier that way. So let's go over it one more time. So fingers as a launching pad, make sure you've got even stitches, even depth on either side. Bring your thread through. And as that loop is coming down, these 2 fingers are going to hold it in place by pinching them. And each of those stitches, when you get that down, each of those stitches will lay parallel to the one before it. So let me just show you a little bit more quickly what that looks like, because it seems like a lot of stuff to think about as you're making a seam line. So this is what it looks like when you're just stitching. It's not this arduous process. It's just that you need to get used to those various things, and then it will become second nature, and you'll just do it like you drive a car without thinking. So every stitch you want to tighten up at the end So the tightening up at the end makes it so that you can stuff the pieces firmly. If you don't tighten up at the end, those seams have the tendency to open up a little bit when you go and stuff it nice and firmly. Often I'll put a pin at the end of my stitch to make sure that the seam line comes together perfectly. This seems like a really small amount, but you can see that, I don't know if you can see, that they're slightly off. Not a big deal here. But on some pieces, it might bother you more than others. At the end of the stitch line, I'm just doing 2 or 3 stitches on top of each other to really secure the end of the stitch line. And then I'm going to take my needle and skim it through the surface of the felt and move my ending knot back a little bit. There are certain times when I like to move the ending knot back because I'll be using, when I attach the white part, I'll be stitching along here, and oftentimes you catch that knot in another seam line. So sometimes I like to move it back depending on what the next steps are. So I'll do this knot, the ending knot, one more time too, since we're going over a few things here. So if you hold your thread up like this with your right, I'm holding it with my right hand. I'm going to take my left like this. It looks really awkward, but it allows me to twist the thread, and then I can have all my fingers through that hole. I'm going to switch my needle from one hand to another and the loop from one hand to another. The important thing for doing the ending knot is holding the loop in your 3 fingers here and clutching the thread from the opposite side in your opposite hand. And then you're going to draw that crossing down to the surface. So I'm going to open these fingers so that I don't lose control of the loop, and I'm going to hold this tight, and then I can come over here with these fingers tight. I can come over here with my thumb and get that knot right down to the surface. So let's look at that one more time. Left hand, make a loop. All my fingers grab the needle and transfer it. Transfer the loop with 3 fingers of my right hand. Hold tight, and press my thumb. All right, so that's it for that. So then on this guy, we would have 2 more seams. I'll just do those off camera right now, and then I'll show you the buttonhole stitch to do the edge of the lemon. Okay, so I have my 3 darts stitched, and what I'm going to do here is just turn this right side out, and then we can stitch our little pith piece with our slices onto the skin. Just FYI, these 2 pieces are a little bit different. This is what's on your pattern. This was an early one that I did, so these guys are all butted up in the center. So this is not the correct one, but the depth here is correct. So I'm going to get this attached. Just going to put a pin on either side through this little seam allowance here to get me started. You've got that narrow seam line that we left with the cardboard. All right, so that'll get us started. And what I want to do is leave 1/3 of this open for stuffing. So I'm just going to start my stitch just before this seam line, maybe a little less than 1/3. We're going to start from a little bit before here, stitch around the circumference, and go a little beyond this 1/3 dart here. So for this, we're going to do a buttonhole stitch, and we're going to use 2 strands of thread. Did I use 2 strands? Actually, let me double check that. No, I used a single strand. Let's use a single strand of thread. All right. The single strand of thread will show up a little bit less, excuse that glue on my finger, a little bit less than the 2 strands. Sometimes we want that stitch, buttonhole stitch, to be more visible, and sometimes we want it to be a little less visible. I think it was the leaf that I used the 2 strands. so that it would cover the wire. All right, so I've got my needle threaded. I'm going to use a full length of thread on this. Usually I break my skeins into 8 equal pieces, which are just under 40 inches long, and then I split those in half to do most of my stitching. When you have a long strand like this and you're doing a whip stitch, it will weaken about midway through and break. So I like to use smaller pieces to stitch with. But the buttonhole stitch uses quite a lot of thread, so I'm going to use a full strand here. And do my starting knot again. And I'm going to draw my crossing down so that to make my thread as short as possible, even though I have a long piece of thread. All right, so we're going to start at just before our dart, and I'm going to put my knot on the inside of the skin there so that it's hidden between the layers. And then here we go on the buttonhole stitch. It starts just like a whip stitch, and you want the same depth on either side, just like a whip stitch. And then I always do it this way. When I come down to my loop here, I go through what I like to call the back of the loop, right? Because it's going in the direction of my stitching. That would maybe be the front, that would be the front of my loop because of the direction of my stitching. But anyhow, so this is the way, right? Through the back of your loop. And watch out for those pins. And then that's going to come down and it forms a little twist. So get a couple more of these going. It forms a little twist which locks the stitch down and makes a little line that connects the stitches. So I'll do a couple more of those with this, the way that I always do it, which is, but you have to make sure, see how there's a loop there? You have to make sure you're going through the right side still. So some of you might prefer this other method, but I find it slows me down a little bit, but as you're learning the stitch, it might be a way that you like to do it better. So you can go through like that, and then you take your thread, that's the working thread that's attached to your work here, and you go like this. And that does the same thing. So you go through, it's almost like knitting, you know, like the American way of knitting, where you come around and you bring your yarn or your thread around your needle. So you might like that way better. So you can definitely try that. Something about the something about that action feels, you know, feels like it slows me down a little, but I think it's a really good way to do it when you're just starting. So we'll do a couple more of those, and we'll do a couple more of my way here. So this, okay, so now I just got a knot. Oftentimes these are just slip knots, so usually you can pull them out. All right, so for me, what I end up doing is usually when I have a big loop like this, I take it and I go behind. And I take it and I go behind and just grab that. So I don't wait till the loop is small to grab the loop. I grab the loop right at the beginning of my stitch. I just pick it up. I think it just, it's one less step. Like picking up the thread with your needle rather than picking it up with your fingers and then making that twist around it. Okay, so at this point, I'm about, you know, not quite to my next dart, but this is a good place to add another pin in here and make sure that the pith is is even around, or the fabric is even around here, and that you're not going to come up with a gap at the end. So there we go. And that's what your stitch looks like from the outside. It really does look just like a whip stitch, but that extra connection, I think, is a nice thing to have around the outside of the lemon. When you do the buttonhole stitch, if you're just getting started with whip stitches and buttonhole stitches, they tend to look more evenly spaced than the whip stitch as you're getting used to using them. So I have a lot of students who prefer the buttonhole stitch in a lot of places to the whip stitch because they feel like it looks more finished to them. So it is, however, not as strong used on the inside of like a head or something like that. Using it on an outside stitch, it's fine. But when you're turning something, buttonhole stitches, when they're stuffed from the back side, tend to open up in a funny way that I'm not sure I can explain, but I don't like to use them on the inside of heads or things like that if I can avoid it. So there we are, a couple more stitches. Oh, there's another one of those knots. If your thread gets frayed at the end, sometimes I just cut off the end to help me so that whatever bits get frayed don't make tangles happen more easily. And we'll do a couple more of those other ones. Oops, forgot to do it. Okay, there we go. So you would go ahead and stitch up just beyond this dart, and then you're going to stuff through this hole here. So that is it for the little stitching demo. I hope you guys have a great day, and I'll talk to you soon. Take care. Bye.